in these organizations, they tend to have different people, different practices, different leaders. Tight organizations and units and teams tend to have people who are careful and conscientious. Their practices tend to be standardized and efficient and formal. There's a lot of socialization and onboarding, and leaders tend to be pretty independent. They call the shots. We find that loose organizations have people who are much more open and risk-taking. They have lots of discretion and experimentation. They're informal, sometimes even to the point of seeming chaotic. And their leaders tend to be visionary and collaborative. But nevertheless, even though groups have to veer tight or loose for good reason in organizations, what I find is that sometimes organizations get too extreme in either direction, and that's where we have a lot of problems.
Welcome to the TalentGrow Show, where you can get actionable, results-oriented insight and advice on how to take your leadership, communication, and people skills to the next level and become the kind of leader people want to follow. And now, your host and leadership development strategist, Halelly Azulay.
Hey, talent growers, welcome back to another episode of the TalentGrow Show. I'm Halelly Azulay, your leadership development strategist here at TalentGrow, where we develop leaders that people actually want to follow. And this week, I am bringing to you a very interesting perspective about cultural norms and cultural norms that affect you both at a national level, at an international level, at an organizational level, and even inside of your family and your close relationships. And I'm excited that this week I have a university professor from the university that I attended, both from my bachelor's and my master's degree, University of Maryland at College Park. Her name is Michele Gelfand, and I think that you're going to enjoy listening to her insights. And she talks fast, so strap on your seatbelt and get ready. Here we go. Talent growers, this week I have Professor Michele Gelfand. She's a distinguished university professor of psychology at the University of Maryland College Park, my alma mater. Her pioneering research, Her pioneering research into cultural norms has been cited thousands of times in the press, including in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Harvard Business Review, and Science, and on NPR. And now on the TalentGrow Show, she's the recipient of numerous awards, past president of the International Association for Conflict Management. Michele, welcome to the TalentGrow Show.
I'm so happy to be here.
I'm glad that you're here. And before we start to dive into your book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World, I always ask my guests to describe their professional journey. Where did you start and how did you end up where you are today? Briefly.
Sure. So I'm a cross-cultural psychologist, and I've been passionate about studying culture for several decades. Culture is this really interesting phenomenon. It's omnipresent. It's all around us, but we rarely recognize it. It's really invisible, but it's affecting everything from our politics to our parenting, our leadership, our organizations, and we need to know more about it. I actually discovered the field of cross-cultural psychology really serendipitously. I was pre-med, and I went to London for a semester, and I felt so much culture shock as a junior in college. And I remember calling my father and asking him for advice. I was telling him how strange it was, for example, for people just to go from London to Paris for just the weekend. And my dad said something that changed my life, actually, and really steered me into this career. He said, well, think about it like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania, in his Brooklyn accent. and that word gave me so much courage and comfort that the next day, this is a true story, I booked a trip to Egypt. And it was just like going from New York to California, I reasoned. I told my dad this, who was kind of a little bit upset that I was flying away to somewhere so far. And it was in Egypt and in later travels that I realized just how powerful a force culture was, but I knew very little about it. And by extension, about myself. So I ditched my plans to become a medical doctor, and I got a PhD in cross-cultural, social and organizational psychology to use the tools of science to understand our deeper cultural codes. So life happens when you're making other plans, as they say.
Yeah. Wow. Well, good for you for following your newfound passion and going for it. And something that you may not know, and talent growers I don't think know, is that when I was studying at the University of Maryland, what I studied was intercultural communication.
Wow.
Yeah. So we definitely, and I didn't really get into that field of work. We can talk about why, but it's always been very, very intriguing to me. So in your book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, you describe a way of viewing our cultural diversity through a new lens, and you look through how we adhere to social norms. So some people are what you say tight. They stick to the norms pretty closely and they follow the rules. And other people you say are loose. So they eschew strict rules and they prefer to be free to do what they feel like. So it's an interesting way of looking at cultural diversity. And I wonder, what made you study this? What made you discover this lens? And how do you compare it to some of the already existing ways that we look at diversity or cultural differences?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And, often it's the case that we think about culture in terms of rather superficial characteristics like red versus blue or east versus west or rich or poor. And I wanted to understand the more deeper cultural codes that drive our behavior. And much of the research in my field has been focused on values, but I started to see lots of differences around the world in terms of norms or these kind of unwritten, sometimes formalized standards for behavior that seem to be so diverse across the world. For example, why can't you bring gum into the country in Singapore? And at the same time, you take a short trip over to New Zealand and you see people in New Zealand walking barefoot in banks and burning couches on college campuses. Or, take a trip to Germany, you see people waiting very patiently on the street corners in many places, even if there's no cars around, compared to my home state of New York City, where people jaywalk all the time with their kids in tow. And I started noticing that there seems to be a distinction between how strict or permissive, or what I call tight and loose, differences around the world. And so I set out to really try to systematically study this. We did a study with a large interdisciplinary research team around the world to try to assess tight, loose, the strictness of social norms across 33 nations. And it was published in Science some years ago. And what was fascinating is just like we could place people on, some dimensions of personality, like extroversion or introversion, we can also, generally speaking, understand which nations are tighter or looser. Places like Japan and Singapore, Austria, Germany veered tight in our data. Places like New Zealand and Brazil and Greece and the US to some extent were veering loose. And what was so super interesting about this is, why did these differences develop? And that's what I was looking at in that study. It turns out that culture has quite a bit of an important rationale. It's not random. What we found was that cultures, this is at the national level, but later we show this with states, with social class, cultures that have a lot of threat tend to develop strict societies. And that threat could be from Mother Nature, it could be disasters and famine, or it could be human threat, like invasions or population density or economic failures. And when you have a lot of threat, it's pretty simple. You need strong rules to help coordinate to survive those threats, those collective action problems. So groups that tend to be looser tend to have less threat in our data. And so it's super exciting to try to understand this pattern across nations. We later then showed that you could put the US on a new map that shows how tight or loose the 50 states are. Again, the states that are the tightest are the ones that have the most disasters, pathogens, and other threats. Social class is also another level of analysis. Organizations. I know many of your podcast listeners are deeply interested in organizations, and we can see that tight loose also differentiates organizations. And what's also really interesting is that tight loose, whether it's found at the level of nations or states or organizations, produces a very similar trade-off. And that is that tight societies and groups tend to have a lot of order. They have a lot of synchrony, they have a lot of uniformity, and they have a lot of self-control. And loose cultures tend to be more disorganized. They tend to have less self-control, less synchrony. But on the flip side, loose cultures tend to be very open to different types of people, to different ideas. They're more creative and they're more adaptive to change, whereas tight cultures struggle with those issues. So that's the kind of gist of the book, is we could take this lens, this simple lens, and understand cultural differences at many different contexts, including, by the way, in our own households. And that's something I write about in Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, is how we understand and diagnose tight loose and use it to our benefit.
Wow. Okay. So that's a lot. So let's break this down a little bit. So you say that you can kind of guess or assess whether a culture is more likely to be loose or more likely to be tight if you can assess that it's a place that has more risk, more danger.
Well, yeah, those kinds of factors push groups towards having greater tightness. Actually, it doesn't have to be chronic levels of threat. I studied this over like 100 years and even looked at it in traditional societies that existed hundreds of years ago, that the same template could be seen, that the groups that had the most threat tended to have the tightest norms. But what's really important also is that this can change dramatically. So for example, I can bring people into my laboratory and I can activate threats like terrorism or natural disasters or other types of threats that we have. And within minutes, you could see people tightening up. They want stronger rules. It's like this instinctive kind of process where when we're under threat, we tighten up. And we see that happening even all around this country. When people feel threatened, whether it's real or imagined, they actually, in our research, they desire stronger norms, more autocratic leaders. And so this is something that's, both we find it chronically with groups, but also it can change rather quickly.
Interesting. So for our listeners, as they are existing within organizations, although of course most of our listeners are experiencing also cultural diversity in their organizations, because obviously the world is becoming much more globalized and people from different countries travel and work in other places. But even if we think about what you just said, the organizational culture and maybe even the cultural diversity, however you want to take this, what are some important things that leaders need to know about looseness and tightness in their environment?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I actually just visited Glassdoor to talk about this with their organization. And, really the biggest point is that we can use the power of social norms in terms of tightness and looseness. We can harness the power of them to have better effectiveness in our organizations. And so for leaders out there and people who are interested in having better workplaces, we need to diagnose the level of tight, loose in our organization and think about how it fits with our needs. So we know, and I read about this in Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, that the level of tight, loose in organizations also tends to evolve for good reasons. Tightness abounds in industries that face threat and need coordination. Think about nuclear power plants or hospitals or airlines, police departments, construction. They develop a lot of rules due to their life or death kind of stakes. Even organizations that are accountable to laws and regulations tend to be tight. Think lawyers, auditors, bankers, are bound to higher standards of professional accountability, have a lot of compliance monitoring. So industries tend to veer tight or loose depending on the need for coordination. Loose organizations have less threat and they're more informal, they're more mobile, they're more diverse. Think, design, consulting. And, in these organizations, they tend to have different people, different practices, different leaders. Tight organizations and units and teams tend to have people who are careful and conscientious. Their practices tend to be standardized and efficient and formal. There's a lot of socialization and onboarding, and leaders tend to be pretty independent. They call the shots. We find that loose organizations have people who are much more open and risk-taking. They have lots of discretion and experimentation. They're informal, sometimes even to the point of seeming chaotic. And their leaders tend to be visionary and collaborative. But nevertheless, even though groups have to veer tight or loose for good reason in organizations, what I find is that sometimes organizations get too extreme in either direction, and that's where we have a lot of problems. So, for example, take United. Some years ago had a massive PR problem. United needs to veer tight given its industry, but arguably was getting too tight. And I advocated in an op-ed that we need to introduce some discretion, some flexibility into that tight system. We want it to be tight. It needs to be tight, but we need to find as leaders and managers ways to introduce discretion. At the flip side, you have organizations like Uber or Tesla that veer loose, but arguably have also gotten too loose, that need to introduce some structure into those contexts. I call that structure and looseness. So this is what I call really a broader principle, which is the Goldilocks principle of tight loose. Each person in an organization needs to diagnose the level of tightness and looseness in their team, in their unit, in their organization, and think about whether or not it's too tight or too loose and start recalibrating those social norms. The best leaders are ambidextrous. They can balance both tight and loose. And even innovation as a basic process requires both tight and loose. It requires the looseness that helps people come up with great ideas, but it requires tightness to help implement them and scale them up. And, it's remarkable, this is a hidden dimension. It's not something we think about. But once we have the language of tight loose, we can start diagnosing it in organizations and really discussing it and negotiating it. I have been studying mergers and acquisitions across the tight and loose divide. And again, the larger the difference between the level of tight loose, the much more difficult it is, these mergers. And I have ideas of how to help negotiate that before we actually try to merge. And we hit this kind of iceberg of the different people, practices, and leaders that constitute tight and loose organizations. So the leaders out there, the managers, people who are in organizations should think about tight, loose, and how to really negotiate it for maximal effectiveness.
Okay, so there's Goldilocks effect. How do they know what's just the right amount?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, I think that once you start getting to the point where tightness becomes so overwhelming that people don't feel comfortable expressing dissent, just like happened in the United case, or they don't feel comfortable challenging the rules, or in the looseness context. Once, looseness kind of becomes extreme, things become very unpredictable and chaotic, and they're equally problematic, these extremes, and we can try to diagnose them. And then we can help make shifts. If a group is getting too loose, we can start engaging in more structure and more monitoring, more benchmarking. Vice versa, with very tight groups, if we feel like things are getting too standardized, too formal, and too conformist, we could start to help people have spaces to brainstorm in a safe way, to give them some voice and discretion. Even places like the military, I'm working a lot with the military on issues of tight loose. It's places like the Navy, you need to be tight, but how can we introduce some discretion that's not safety related? Often it's the case that we have a lot of rules, but the question is, do we really need all of those rules? Yeah. And that's a good way to start, is to really think about what rules really matter. A lot of organizations that want to change in either direction, it's not easy because people are used to having a lot of control in tight cultures. They're used to having a lot of autonomy in loose cultures. So leaders need to really help people to feel, we're loosening up, but we still have a lot of control, or we're tightening up, but we still have a lot of autonomy, and to really talk with their employees about this on these shifts. And again, the best leaders can use the terminology to try to help people understand and participate in the kind of changes. And in the book, I talk about different scenarios of when I've interviewed managers and firms that have been trying to either become tighter or looser, the kind of problems they had, the kind of solutions that they came up with, the kinds of, sometimes having gone almost to the exact opposite extreme and having to scale back a little bit because people didn't like the changes. So there's no simple recipe. But again, once you have the language and understand the concepts, it starts becoming exciting to try to actually implement change and help people understand the reason for it and how it will maintain the same core of what norm strength is needed given the industry, but how we might recalibrate that a little bit so that we can have some balance.
Interesting. Yeah. Culture is very hard to change. When people become embedded in cultural norms of their organization, of their native culture, whatever the source is, obviously the more longstanding your adherence to certain norms or your exposure to certain norms is, the harder it'll be to change.
Yeah, that's right. And definitely our research shows that it's harder to change in tight cultures. We've done a lot of work, not just in field research, but also with computer modeling to show that actually it takes a lot longer to change norms in tight cultures, which have more inertia. But, it's still possible to change, especially when we can understand why these differences exist in the first place and how we're going to change, but not go through a total change. So gradual, incremental type of change.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because kind of if you're a rule follower, then this is the way we've always done it is kind of the mantra. So this is probably very anathema to innovation or to really shifting quickly or pivoting in a changing environment. This is going to be a problem for those kinds of organizations. We've seen that.
I mean, I agree. And actually, we have some research I talk about in the book where we could see that even as young as 3 years old, we see differences in groups in terms of how much they are attending to norms and noticing norm violations. It happens really early. Actually, norms are something that we become aware of even before we can speak. So there's a lot of interesting research on this. And so you take a person who's now in their 30s or 40s or 50s, or so forth, and try to change their level of norms, abidance or breaking. And it is something that is a process. It can't happen overnight.
Yeah, makes sense. So now that you've spoken about how early this can start, we can shift to this perspective. We went from cultural to organizational. We can shift to perspective to our interpersonal or personal effectiveness. What are some things that are going to help us harness this understanding to improve our own effectiveness in our personal relationships and just in our own well-being?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question because each of us has our own default setting on the tight loose mindset. I talk about this in the book. I even have a mindset quiz that you can take on my website that helps people to see, where do you naturally fall? We also can recalibrate depending on the situation. When we're all in a library, we all quickly tighten up versus when we're in a party. But, each of us has our own default setting for our own personal reasons and experiences. People who are tight on this quiz are rule makers. They are people who are attending to norms and registering those rules, managing their impulses. They tend to like a lot of order and structure. Kind of like I use the Muppet sort of metaphor that Dahlia Whitlick talked about. These people are like Kermit the Frog and Bert. This is what I call the sort of tight mindset. But people who veer loose are rule breakers. They don't tend to notice rules as much. They're more risk-taking, quasi-impulsive. They embrace ambiguity. They're like the Cookie Monster or other types of
animal.
Or animal, exactly, with his crazy hair. And, but understanding our own mindset and where it comes from can be really empowering because it helps us to see why we act and react with different people around us and why we struggle in some situations. Once we can label this as, okay, they have a different mindset than us. This is a different situation that conflicts with my tight mindset. If you have a tight mindset and you're in a lot of loose situations or vice versa, that lack of fit can be causing a lot of stress. Also, it's, as I mentioned, what's really exciting about understanding tight loose from my point of view is that we can help to negotiate with people around us who have very different mindsets than us. A lot of the conflicts that we have, whether it's with our spouse or kids or bosses or colleagues, are in large part caused by differences in tight loose mindsets. If you think about if you're a parent, are you a helicopter parent who likes to enforce a tight ship? Are you co-parenting with someone who's more laissez-faire, lets kids do their own things? It applies to vacations. I talk about this with my family, my extended family. On vacations, I have conflict with relatives who like to have everything structured and planned, and versus, having a lot of spontaneity and lack of planning, which might seem very chaotic to people with a tight mindset. It also happens with financial decision-making, with how messy we are, but we can negotiate it. I actually, with my teenagers and husband, we talk about, well, what domains do we really need to be tight in? And what domains can we loosen up in? We can actually think about it and prioritize and help trade off, like in any good negotiation, like what are our priorities and how do we kind of negotiate the domains that we feel can be tight and loose? And we actually can do it. We've done it many times in my household.
Huh, neat. Well, yeah, it's interesting. I can't help but to think of an overlap between what you're describing and how we describe personality differences. So, for example, like in the Myers-Briggs, when you describe judging versus perceiving, a lot of times there's like an openness to new stimuli and new ideas and not being oriented towards closure, whereas someone who's more of a judging orientation to their energy, they like closure and they like structure and they like things to be kind of prescribed. Have you ever done any research comparing them?
Well, I haven't used the Myers-Briggs, but we can see clearly that across, again, nations, states, individuals, that tight mindsets are associated with conscientiousness as a trait.
Yeah.
But I find that it's associated with a cluster of personality traits, not just one. So for example, tight mindsets are associated with high self-monitoring, which means like monitoring the rules around you and trying to fit into the situation. It also relates to emotional regulation, like how much I'm managing my impulses, which is more related to other dimensions of personality. And then you have also kind of the need for structure, cautiousness, prevention focus that you're describing that relates to conscientiousness. So it really kind of is a cluster of personality characteristics, all that relate to your attention to rules or lack thereof. The other thing is that I think what tight loose tries to focus on is the basis of the evolutionary basis for these differences. A lot of times, people veer tight or loose for good reasons based on their childhoods or based on their experiences or based on their occupation that you're in. I mean, for example, my husband's a lawyer. Like he's got to be tighter than me because he's constantly has the kind of occupational context that pushes you toward that kind of risk aversion or rule-making behavior. And so I think once we step back and think, well, why does that person have a different mindset than me versus this is something that just arose randomly, it helps us to have more empathy for people. And so that's what I think helps when we think about how to create better relationships and negotiate. Part of that comes from understanding ourselves. Why are we the way we are? Why might I have developed more of a quasi-loose mindset versus others? So that's what's kind of exciting about it, is to diagnose our own and others and then to try to empathize and understand and then negotiate.
Yeah, it makes sense. So the more that you have an awareness of this difference even exists, like any other difference, a lot of times we just see the world through the lens that comes naturally to us. And when you look at someone who seems to be behaving very differently or who seems to be motivated by a very different kind of impulses, you look at them like, well, are you crazy? What's wrong with you? So when you this is nice because then you understand that, oh, it's because they are oriented differently or they're, wired differently or they were raised differently. And now I can put what I'm noticing into a different perspective. And then I can approach it with, as you said, with empathy and a willingness to negotiate.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, I study negotiation. So I think what's really encouraging is that we can say, well, what's really important to you? Like if I'm really messy around the house and that's really irritating my spouse, like, okay, but what domains am I going to lobby for that I want to be looser on vacations or other things? So part of it is like prioritizing, like what are the most important domains that we must be tight or loose in?
Yeah.
We might not always agree on that, but I'm pretty messy and my kids are messy, but I think that might bother my spouse more than me, but it's also, there's other more important domains that need to be tight. And so that's what's, I think, good to think about it in terms of priorities.
Yeah. And like pick your battles, right?
Exactly. Pick your battles. And it applies to in organizational life also. It's helping to understand the conflicts we have through a tight, loose lens, helps us to feel empowered that we understand them more. I've had a lot of people send me through my website. I have a place where people can send in stories. And I've had a lot of people send in stories about how they realize that some of the issues they've been having in the organization relate to these differences or in their marriage or in, when they travel places. Often we send people abroad based on their technical expertise. We don't send them based on their fit with the cultural context. And I recently was showing that expatriates who go to cultures that match their personal mindset are much happier, for example. And the same could be said of in an organization, people whose mindset matches the culture of the organization. We know from decades of research in organizational culture and fit that matters. So I think more generally, understanding this can help us in a lot of different contexts.
Yeah. Awesome. Good. All right. Well, we're almost out of time. So before you share one specific actionable tip, what's new and exciting? I know you laughed at that.
Just one?
Just one.
Okay.
What's new and exciting for you these days? What's got your attention?
Well, I'm really interested in changes of norms, and we've been starting to develop some techniques where we can look at changes in norms in tight loose over long periods of time. We just published a paper recently looking at changes in norms across the last 200 years in the United States and trying to track what's associated with that. As we become looser, we become more creative in our research, but we also tend to have less order. And so it's really exciting to start thinking about culture as dynamic and shifting. Also, we're doing a lot of work on tight loose ambidexterity. How do we help leaders diagnose the extremes or balance their units and their organizations better when it comes to norm strength? So that's really super exciting.
Nice. Well, sounds good. And I look forward to seeing the results of that research. So what's one, even though I know you have so many to share, what's one actionable tip or piece of advice that you have for our listeners that they can take action on today, this week, that can help them ratchet up their own leadership success based on your lens?
So I would say probably the best actionable thing would be to take the tight loose mindset quiz at my website, which is michelegelfand.com, because then you can get a sense of where do you fall on the spectrum. And then you can start thinking about using this concept, this terminology, to diagnose issues that maybe have been something you couldn't quite understand as clearly. And so the lens will help people understand themselves and then start using it to diagnose people around them.
Sounds good. We'll link to that in the show notes. So I imagine that a way for people to stay in touch with you would be to visit your website. Are there any other ways that you'd like people to stay connected and learn more from and about you?
Sure. I mean, my website really has everything on there. It has all my stuff in the popular press, all my research articles. It has lots of pictures. It has other tools that I think people could be interested in. And of course, I'd really love to hear from your audience. I really want to see how we can partner together to help improve organizational effectiveness. And I'm always open to emails and to you sending your stories. And I hope that you'll read Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, because I wasn't able to really get to the gist of a lot of it.
Well, yeah.
And there's also lots of information about the book on the website too.
Okay, great. And we'll link to the book as well in the show notes. So thanks for joining us today on the TalentGrow Show. You are now the second University of Maryland professor.
Woo!
And the first one was Dr. Edwin Locke. He is a professor emeritus.
Fabulous. I love your show and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for taking time today and sharing your insights. All right, talent growers, I hope that you enjoyed that fast ride with Michele Gelfand and that you learned a lot and that you're going to take action based on what you learned. I'd love to hear what action you plan to take, or if you're fast, what you learned from taking action. We link to everything in the show notes page, which is on my website, talentgrow.com, for this episode. And as always, I welcome your feedback because I am on a learning journey and I keep growing based on feedback. So I need your feedback and, of course, suggestions for future topics, future content, future guests are always, always welcome. Share this episode with one other person that you think can also benefit. And that way we can grow the listener base and get more people to gain value from the work that I put out into the world. Thank you in advance for that. I appreciate you listening. I hope that you stay in touch and listen to the next episode. But until the next time, I'm Halelly Azulay, your leadership development strategist here at TalentGrow. And this is the TalentGrow Show. Thanks for listening. Make today great.
Thanks for listening to the TalentGrow Show, where we help you develop your talent to become the kind of leader that people want to follow. For more information, visit talentgrow.com.